On Father's Day, my daughter Anika sent me a box. My wife took one look at it and her voice trembled. "Theo, don't you dare open that." When she showed me why, I didn't just leave it sealed. I made a phone call, and 10 minutes later, sirens were screaming down our quiet suburban street. Before I tell you what happened next, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a parent's intuition is never wrong. The morning had started with a quiet satisfaction. At 72, a man learns to appreciate the small things. The sun slanting through the blinds, the rich smell of Amani's coffee, the familiar comfort of our home in the Atlanta suburbs. On the coffee table sat the only gift I'd received, a shoebox-sized package wrapped in plain brown paper. It was from our daughter Anika. I smiled. It had been a while since I'd heard her voice, and even longer since I'd seen her bright, infectious laugh. The wrapping was a little clumsy, the tape uneven, which was unlike her. Anika was a perfectionist, an architect who saw beauty in clean lines and precision. But I dismissed it as a sign of haste, the busyness of her life, a life that felt increasingly distant from ours. Amani walked in from the kitchen, a mug in each hand. She stopped dead in the middle of the living room, her eyes fixed on the box. A strange stillness came over her. "Theo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't open it." I chuckled, reaching for my coffee. "Now, Amani, don't be like that. I'm sure it's another pair of socks, but it's the thought that counts." I winked at her, but her expression didn't change. It was a look I hadn't seen in years, a look of profound unease that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "I'm not joking," she said, setting the mugs down with a soft click. "Don't open it. Can't you see?" "See what?" It was just a plain brown box. I picked it up. It felt light, almost empty. "What is it, honey? What am I supposed to see?" She moved closer, her finger trembling as she pointed to the bottom corner, near a seam where the tape was peeling away slightly. "There," she breathed. "Look closer." I squinted. My 72-year-old eyes weren't what they used to be. At first, all I saw was a small, dark smudge the color of dried mud. "It's just a little dirt, Amani, probably from the delivery truck." She shook her head fiercely, her jaw tight. "No, it's not dirt." She leaned in, her nostrils flaring slightly. The look on her face sent a shard of ice through my heart. "I was a nurse for 40 years, Theo. I've cleaned more wounds than I can count. I know the smell of iron. I know the smell of dried blood." My own breath hitched in my chest. I lowered my head, bringing the corner of the box closer to my face. And then I smelled it. Faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. A coppery metallic scent. The scent of life spilled and left to dry. I froze. Everything in the room seemed to recede, the cheerful sunlight, the aroma of coffee, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. All of it was swallowed by a sudden, terrifying void. Anika would never be this careless. She would never send something stained, unless she couldn't help it, unless she didn't have a choice. I gently placed the box back on the table, as if it were a bomb. I looked at Amani, and in her wide, frightened eyes, I saw my own terror reflected back at me. A silent understanding passed between us, a lifetime of shared fears and hopes culminating in this single horrific moment. My hand was steady as I pulled out my phone. My fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. I didn't call 911. Not yet. I scrolled through my contacts to a name I hadn't called in years. Morris. My voice was raspy, a stranger's voice in my own throat. "Morris, it's Theo Covington. I need you to get to my house. Right now. Don't ask questions, just come. And bring a forensics team." I ended the call before he could respond. Then, and only then, did I dial 911 to report a potential emergency, my words clipped and precise, betraying none of the chaos churning inside me. The 10 minutes it took for the sirens to appear felt like 10 years. A thick, suffocating silence descended on the room, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. In that silence, my mind began to race, tumbling back through years of forced smiles and ignored warnings. A slideshow of my daughter's life flickered behind my eyes, and every frame was tainted by the shadow of one man, my son-in-law, Chad. I remember the day Anika brought him home. He was everything you'd expect a successful white investment broker to be. Charming, handsome, with a smile that could sell sand in the desert. He said all the right things, complimented Amani's cooking, and listened with rapt attention as I talked about my old woodworking business. He seemed perfect. Too perfect. There was always a subtle condescension lurking beneath his polished surface. a way he'd call me sir that felt more like a put-down than a sign of respect. He'd gently correct Anika in front of us, framing it as a helpful suggestion, but it was always a quiet assertion of control. He made jokes about our humble neighborhood, always comparing it to his own affluent upbringing in a way that was meant to sound self-deprecating, but was really just a reminder of his perceived superiority. We saw it, Imani and I, we saw it all. But we stayed quiet. We didn't want to be the stereotypical disapproving in-laws. We didn't want to risk pushing Anika away. So we smiled, we nodded, and we welcomed him into our family, ignoring the cold knot of dread in our stomachs. That knot tightened the day Anika came to us, her eyes shining with excitement, talking about the dream house Chad had found for them. The only problem was the down payment. Chad's money was tied up in a long-term investment, he'd explained with a wave of his hand. It was just temporary. I looked at my daughter's hopeful face, and I made a decision that I would come to regret for the rest of my life. I sold the workshop, my sanctuary, the place where I had turned rough-hewn timber into art for over 40 years. It was more than a business. It was a piece of my soul. I gave them the money, every last cent, a loan, without interest or a repayment date. It was for my daughter's happiness, I told myself. Chad shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes full of practiced gratitude. "We'll pay you back every penny, Theo," he'd promised. That was 5 years ago. We never saw a dime. The money wasn't the issue. It was the principle. It was the casual way our sacrifice was accepted and then forgotten as if it were our duty, our obligation. It was the first clear sign that to Chad, we weren't family. We were a resource. Over the years, we watched our daughter change. The bright spark in her eyes began to dim. Anika, my fiercely independent girl who had put herself through architecture school, started to second-guess every decision. Chad managed their finances, he said, because he was the expert. She stopped calling as often. When she did, her voice was strained, her answers to our questions vague and rehearsed. I could always tell when he was in the room with her, listening on the other end. The last time I spoke to her just a few days ago, her voice was a thin whisper. She mentioned something about Chad's investments going sour, about him needing her to co-sign for new loans. I told her to be careful, to think about it. "I have to go, Dad," she'd said abruptly, and the line went dead. I felt a chill, then a deep sense of foreboding, but like all the other times, I did nothing. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that it was just a normal marital spat. I chose the comfort of denial over the hardship of confrontation. And now this box, this ugly brown box with its damning secret stained on the corner. It wasn't a gift. It was a message. It was the price of my silence. The wail of the sirens grew louder, closer, a sound of reckoning for all the things I had left unsaid, for all the moments I had failed to act. The time for silence was over. The distant wail of sirens sliced through the heavy silence in our living room. It wasn't a sound of chaos, but of an inevitable beginning. Imani squeezed my hand, her knuckles white. She said nothing, but I could feel a slight tremor in her touch. But me, I wasn't trembling. Strangely, the initial terror that had gripped me had solidified into something sharp, something focused. 2 police cruisers pulled up smoothly to the curb, their flashing lights painting silent rotating streaks of red and blue across our walls. I was already at the door waiting. The man who stepped out of the lead car wasn't a stranger. He was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the easy authority of a man comfortable in his own skin. It was David Morris. His face was etched with the seriousness of his job, but in the eyes that met mine there was a respect that time hadn't erased. Nearly 20 years ago, Morris had been a directionless kid on the verge of making some bad life choices. I'd taken him on of the workshop, taught him not just how to plane a piece of wood until it was true, but how to build a life that was just as straight. He never forgot. "Theo," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. It wasn't the voice of a cop addressing a civilian. It was the voice of a man addressing a mentor. "You called." I nodded, my own voice hoarser than I expected. "David, thanks for coming so fast. Come on in." I led him into the living room, where the box sat on the coffee table like a silent accusation. A forensics team, 2 people in white coveralls, followed with their sterile silver cases. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was both reassuring and terrifying. They didn't speak a word, communicating with slight gestures as they began photographing the box from every conceivable angle, their presence making the nightmare suddenly undeniably real. Imani stood pressed against the wall by the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes never leaving that dreadful package. Morris took in the scene, his gaze resting on the box, then on Imani's pale face, and finally on me. He waited. I explained everything, keeping my voice as level as I could, stripping the story of emotion and sticking to the facts. Imani's warning, the faint dark stain, the metallic scent of dried blood, the last stilted phone call with Anika a few days prior. When I finished, Morris was quiet for a long moment, his sharp detective's eyes scanning the room as if trying to read the history in the walls. "You did the right thing calling me," he said finally. "We'll take this back to the lab, get it analyzed right away. But I have to ask Theo, do you think your daughter is in immediate danger?" I met his gaze without flinching. "I don't think it, David," I said, my voice dropping low. "I know it." The forensics team carefully placed the box into a sealed evidence bag. The simple action felt so final, so formal. As they carried it out of our home, it felt like they were carrying away the last shred of normalcy we had left. Morris stayed behind, his expression grim. He understood. He knew me well enough to know I wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. He knew that for me to make a call like this, something had to be terribly, terribly wrong. The trust between us was a silent, unbreakable bond forged in sawdust and shared purpose years ago. And in that moment, it was the only thing I had to hold on to. My phone buzzed on the end table, a harsh, intrusive sound. My whole body went rigid. The screen lit up with a single name: Chad. A wave of cold fury washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. Morris caught my eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He mouthed the words, "speakerphone." I took a deep, steadying breath, tapping the green icon, the press of my thumb feeling unnaturally heavy. "Hello?" I tried to keep my voice even, a calm island in the middle of my internal hurricane. "Theo, is that you? What's going on?" Chad's voice, a carefully modulated baritone designed to convey effortless confidence, filled the room, but I could hear the thin wire of tension running beneath it. "The police just called me asking some bizarre questions about Anika. Is everything all right?" He was already starting laying the foundation of his own innocence. "They're here now, Chad," I said, my voice flat. "Anika sent a Father's Day gift. There's a problem with it." "A problem? What kind of problem? Is she okay? Where is she?" The questions came in a rapid-fire burst, each one layered with a convincing tone of rising panic. It was a masterclass in performative concern. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Morris interjected, his voice cutting through the air with cold authority. "Detective Morris, Atlanta PD. Mr. Miller, would you mind coming down to your father-in-law's house? We have a few things we need to discuss." There was a beat of silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, calculating, recalibrating his strategy. "Of course, Detective," he finally said, his voice smooth as silk again. "I'll be right there. I'm worried sick about her." He hung up. 20 minutes later, a silver BMW 7 Series whispered to a stop behind the patrol cars. Chad emerged, looking every bit the concerned husband. He wore a crisp navy blue polo shirt and tailored khaki pants, an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. He strode into our house not with the frantic energy of a worried man, but with the focused intensity of a CEO entering a hostile boardroom. His eyes scanned the room, taking in me, Imani, and Morris in a single sweeping glance. Then the performance began. He rushed to Imani, enveloping her in a hug. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What's happened? Tell me what's wrong with my Anika." Imani was stiff as a board in his arms, her body language screaming a rejection that he completely ignored. He pulled back, holding her by the shoulders, his handsome face a perfect mask of distress. He turned to me, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "Theo, I should have listened to her. I should have seen the signs." I just stared at him, my face a blank wall. Let him talk. Let him build his own cage. "Signs? What signs are you talking about, Mr. Miller?" Morris asked, his tone neutral. Chad let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Her depression, Detective. It's gotten worse these past few months. She hasn't been herself. She gets these dark moods, locks herself in her studio for days. I've been begging her to see a therapist, but she's so proud, so stubborn." As he spoke, a memory surfaced in my mind, sharp and clear, Anika's hushed voice on the phone just last week. "Dad, I think Chad's in some kind of financial trouble. He keeps getting angry when I ask about our savings." His story was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative to paint my daughter as the problem. He continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. This morning she was distant. She said Father's Day was making her sad, reminding her of her grandfather. She said she just needed to get away to clear her head. She packed a small bag. I thought she just needed some space. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. My God, I should never have let her leave alone in that state. He was brilliant, I had to give him that. He had an explanation for everything. A reason for her absence, a pre-packaged psychological diagnosis, a built-in excuse for any strange behavior. He was framing her as a flight risk, an unstable woman on the verge of a breakdown. Then he turned the full force of his manipulative pity on me. Theo, I know this must be incredibly stressful for you, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You're worried. I get it. But you know how Anika can be when she gets emotional. She's clumsy. She probably cut herself on something while wrapping your gift and didn't even notice. This little bit of blood, it's probably nothing. He was gaslighting me in front of a police detective. He was trying to reduce me to a senile, overreacting old man, a relic whose concerns could be dismissed. I felt a hot rage build in my chest, but I held it down, letting my face remain a cold, hard mask. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of an outburst. Morris stood by the mantelpiece, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word, just watched letting Chad spin his web of lies. Chad seemed to take the detective's silence as a sign of acceptance. His confidence grew. Listen, he said, stepping into the center of the room, taking charge. I'll handle this. I'll call her friends. I'll check the places she likes to go. I'll find her. I'm sure this is all just a big, unfortunate misunderstanding. He looked from me to Morris, a concerned husband, a reasonable man trying to manage a difficult family situation. He had effectively recast the entire scene with himself as the hero. It was breathtaking in its audacity. He walked over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. The touch felt like a brand. You just rest, Theo. Let me take care of my wife. He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of dominance disguised as comfort, before turning and walking out the door. We watched through the window as he got back into his luxury car, made a brief, calm phone call, and then drove away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. The sound of his engine faded, and the front door clicked shut, leaving the three of us in a silence that felt heavier than before. The air was thick with the residue of his lies. Morris let out a long, slow breath, the first sign of emotion he had shown since Chad arrived. He walked over to the window, staring out at the empty street. He's a professional, Morris said, his voice a low rumble of frustration. A professional liar. Every word out of his mouth was calculated. The story is smooth, it's practiced. He was prepared for this. He turned to face me, his expression grim. I believe you, Theo. 100%. I know your daughter, and I know you. You wouldn't call me unless this was real. Amani, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke, her voice trembling. Then what can you do, David? What happens now? Morris shook his head, and the look in his eyes was one I'd seen on good men who were powerless against a broken system. That's the problem, Amani, he said gently. Right now, legally, we have almost nothing. We have a suspicious package, but the lab results will take time. We have a missing person who is a grown adult, and we have a husband with a plausible, if convenient, story. His narrative about her being emotionally unstable, it's a poison. It gives him cover for everything. We can't get a warrant to search his house or his financials based on a hunch and a small stain on a box. He knows it. He's using the rule book against us. He looked directly at me, the frustration clear on his face. My hands are tied, Theo. Without more, I can't move. I need something concrete, something he can't explain away. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This was it. This was the moment the floor fell out from under me. The system I had paid taxes to my whole life, the laws I had respected, the justice I believed in. It was all useless against a clever man with a good story. Chad was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very system that was supposed to protect my daughter. What kind of thing? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Anything, Morris said, his gaze intense. A contradiction in his story. A witness who saw them arguing. A financial record that doesn't add up. Something that proves he's lying. Something that gives me probable cause. Until then, we wait for the lab. And I'm afraid that by then, he didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what he meant. He walked to the door, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Be careful, Theo. A man who can lie that easily is capable of anything. Call me if you think of something. Anything at all." And then he was gone, leaving Amani and me alone in the deafening quiet of our home. The hope that had flickered to life with his arrival was extinguished. It was just us now, and the truth was buried somewhere deep inside Chad's perfect, calculated lies. I knew right then I would have to be the one to dig it out. The front door clicked shut, and the sound echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the house. Morris was gone. The law was gone. The safety net I had foolishly believed would always be there had been pulled away, leaving nothing but a hard, cold floor beneath my feet. Morris's words, "my hands are tied," played over and over in my mind. He wasn't blaming me. He was telling me a simple, brutal truth. The system had rules, and a monster like Chad knew how to hide in the spaces between them. For a long moment, I felt a deep, chilling despair. It was a feeling of utter helplessness, the kind that makes a man want to sit down and let the world wash over him. But then I looked at Amani. She was standing by the kitchen doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of fear and faith. Faith in me. And in that instant, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't just disappear. It was consumed. It became fuel for a furnace that I thought had gone cold decades ago. It was the same fire that had kept me working late nights in the workshop, turning raw timber into something beautiful and strong. For years, I had been quiet. I had swallowed my pride, ignored the subtle insults, and stood by as my son-in-law slowly chipped away at my daughter's spirit. I did it all for the sake of a fragile peace, a peace I now understood was just a well-decorated cage. My silence had been a form of cowardice. My desire to avoid conflict had put my only child in the path of a predator. That ended now. The helplessness receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. It settled deep in my bones, solid and unyielding as a piece of ironwood. Chad saw me as a relic, a frail old man with failing eyes and a sentimental heart. He had dismissed me. He had underestimated me, and that was going to be the biggest mistake of his life. I was no longer just a worried father. I was a craftsman. And my new project was dismantling the fraudulent life of Chad Miller piece by piece. I would use the same patience that allowed me to carve a delicate joint, the same attention to detail that helped me spot a flaw in a plank of wood. I would examine every lie, every boast, every suspicious transaction I had overlooked for years. My mind, which had been clouded with panic, was now startlingly clear. A plan vague at first began to take shape, its edges sharpening with every passing second. "I'll make some coffee," Amani said softly, her voice cutting through my thoughts. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of solidarity. She knew. She saw the change in me. She knew the night was going to be long and that the war had just begun. I nodded, walking over to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the room, a piece I had built with my own two hands. I sat down, the familiar creak of the chair a small comfort. My war wouldn't be fought with fists, but with facts. My weapons would be memories, bank statements, and forgotten details. Chad was a liar in a fancy suit, but I was a carpenter, and I knew how to build a case just as surely as I knew how to build a table. Strong, solid, and true. The coffee Amani made sat cooling on the corner of my desk, its steam rising like a ghost in the lamplight. The house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. This was the moment. The beginning. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. Chad's greatest weapon was his belief that he was the smartest person in any room. My greatest weapon was that he believed I was the weakest. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk, a place I hadn't looked in for years, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound address book. Its pages were filled with names written in my own faded ink, a testament to a life lived, a network built not on transactions, but on handshakes, shared stories, and mutual respect. Chad had his slick business contacts. I had my friends. My finger stopped on a name: Earl Washington. We had served together in the Army a lifetime ago. After his tour, he'd gone into banking, working his way up from a teller to a senior loan officer at a major Atlanta bank before retiring last year. But a man like Earl never truly leaves the game. He still had connections. I dialed the number, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. He picked up on the second ring. "Earl," I said, my voice low. "It's Theo Covington." There was a pause, then a warm, booming laugh. "Theo, as I live and breathe. It's been too long, my friend. What can I do for you on this fine Father's Day evening? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Earl was a man who appreciated directness. I need a favor, Earl. A quiet one. It's about my son-in-law. I could feel the shift in his tone, the banker's caution kicking in. What about him? He's an investment guy. I explained, choosing my words with the care of a man measuring a final cut. Always talking about his ventures. I've been keeping a list. For my daughter's sake. I need to know if these companies are legitimate. I have a bad feeling, Earl, a deep one. Over the years, during countless family dinners, I had sat quietly while Chad pontificated about his brilliant business moves, his voice dripping with arrogance. He'd throw out names of shell corporations and investment vehicles trying to impress the old carpenter with a world I supposedly couldn't understand. But I listened. I always listened. And I wrote the names down. I read the list to Earl now. 3 different LLCs, each with a vague, important-sounding name. I don't want to know details, I said. I just need to know if they're real, if they're solid, or if they're built on smoke. There was a long silence on the other end. You're worried he's a fraud, Earl stated, not as a question, but as a fact. I'm worried for my daughter, I corrected him. He let out a slow breath. Give me 24 hours, Theo. I'll make some calls. I'll be discreet. I thanked him and hung up. One hook was in the water. Next, I found the number for Ben Carter. Ben was the son of my old friend Elias, who had passed away a few years back. Ben was a young lawyer, sharp and hungry, with a reputation for being a bulldog in the courtroom. He specialized in financial law. Ben, it's Theodore Covington, your father's old friend. His voice warmed immediately. Mr. Covington, it's an honor. How are you, sir? I'm afraid I'm not calling for a social visit, son, I said. I need some legal advice. Hypothetically. I laid out a careful, impersonal scenario. Suppose a man suspected his son-in-law of financial misconduct. Suppose he believed the son-in-law might be using his daughter's name and assets in ways she might not fully understand. What would be that man's first step in protecting his family, legally speaking? I didn't mention a missing person. I didn't mention a box stained with blood. I kept it clean, focused on the one thing the law understands better than anything: money. Ben was silent for a moment, processing. The first step, he said, his voice now all business, is to gather proof. Any documents with your daughter's signature. Loan agreements, bank statements, incorporation papers. Without documentation, it's just one person's word against another's. If you can find evidence that he's forged her signature or coerced her into signing something against her interest, that's a federal crime, Mr. Covington. That changes everything. His words were a beacon in the fog. Proof. Documentation. It wasn't about emotion or suspicion, it was about hard facts. Thank you, Ben. That's what I needed to know. I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair. The house was still. The coffee was cold. But for the first time since I saw that box, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. I felt the familiar stirrings of a craftsman with a new project. I had the raw materials, years of observation, a network of trusted men, and a deep, burning motivation. Now it was time to get to work. I pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer. At the top, I wrote a single name: Chad. It was time to start building my case. I sat at my desk for what felt like hours, staring at the blank legal pad. Chad's name was written at the top, a solitary testament to my new grim purpose. Ben Carter's advice echoed in my head: proof, documentation. But where do you start looking for proof when you don't even know what the crime is? My mind felt like a locked room. The answers I needed were inside, but I couldn't find the key. I picked up a piece of mail from my own desk, a utility bill, turning the crisp envelope over in my hands. It was just a plain official document. And then it happened. The simple act of holding that envelope, seeing the printed return address and the official-looking font, was like a spark landing on dry tinder. A memory long buried under a pile of willful ignorance suddenly ignited in my mind, roaring to life with searing clarity. It was from last May. The air was thick with the sweet smell of jasmine and freshly cut grass. I was at Anika and Chad's house fixing a section of the picket fence in their backyard that had come loose after a storm. Anika had asked me to do it, her voice on the phone sounding small and apologetic, as if she were asking for a huge favor. I didn't mind. Working with my hands, feeling the familiar heft of a hammer and the grain of the wood, it was the closest I ever got to the piece I used to find in my old workshop. I had just finished nailing the last picket in place and was gathering my tools. I was thirsty, and on my way to the back porch I passed their recycling bin. It was overflowing. Annoyed at Chad's laziness, I reached in to press the pile of papers down to make more room. And that's when I saw them. It wasn't just junk mail and magazines. Near the top was a thick stack of documents stapled together, still pristine. They looked like closing papers for a property sale. My curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the stack out. The top page was a loan application. The letterhead was for some company I'd never heard of, Apex Pinnacle Holdings LLC, or something equally meaningless. But what made me pause was the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Anika's. Her familiar, graceful script was unmistakable. I flipped through the pages. There were more. Dozens of pages. Loan agreements, promissory notes, title deeds, all signed by my daughter. But the properties listed weren't ones I recognized. They were commercial lots, undeveloped land out in the counties I'd never heard of. And there were multiple lenders, all with similarly vague corporate names. It felt wrong. Anika was a residential architect. Why was she involved in all these complex commercial land deals? Just as I was about to look closer, the back door slid open. Chad stepped out onto the patio holding a glass of iced tea. He was smiling that easy, disarming smile of his. "Hey, Theo," he said cheerfully. "Taking out the trash for us?" "You don't have to do that." He saw the papers in my hand, and for a fraction of a second the smile faltered. A flicker of something cold and sharp passed through his eyes before he masked it again. I held up the documents. "Just saw these. Looks like you two are making some big moves." Chad laughed, a smooth, dismissive sound. He walked over and casually took the stack from my hands, tossing it back into the bin. "Oh, that," he said with a wave of his hand. "Just some boring paperwork for a new realty estate fund I'm putting together. Way over my head, to be honest, but Anika's a genius with this stuff. Don't you worry your head about it. That's what I'm here for, to handle the boring stuff so you and Anika can relax." Anika appeared at the door behind him, then her face pale and tense. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her silence was my answer. I felt a chill, a deep-seated instinct that something was wrong. But I let it go. I didn't want to start a fight. I didn't want to be the meddling father-in-law. I told myself this was his world, the world of high finance, and I was just an old carpenter who didn't understand it. I chose peace. The memory faded, leaving me back at my desk in the dead of night. But the image of those papers was burned into my mind. I saw them with a terrifying new clarity. Apex Pinnacle Holdings. The other names. Anika's signature on dozens of pages she probably never even read. It wasn't boring paperwork. Ben's words came back to me. Gather proof. All this time I had been searching for a key, and I'd had it in my hands months ago and literally thrown it in the trash. The regret was a physical pain, a sharp stabbing in my chest, but it was quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. The papers were the proof. They were the beginning of the trail. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they were the first secret in a web of lies, and I now knew exactly what I was looking for. The phone rang late the next afternoon, startling me from a restless doze in my armchair. I snatched it up before the second ring, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was Earl. I didn't even say hello. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice a dry rasp. Earl didn't waste a second. "Theo," he said, and the usual warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by a grim professional tone. "It's worse than you thought. Those 3 LLCs you asked me about, Apex Pinnacle, Sterling Horizon Ventures, and Gold Key Capital?" "Yes," I said, leaning forward, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. "What about them?" "They're ghosts, Theo," he said flatly. "They exist on paper, registered out of a P.O. box in Delaware, but that's it. There are no assets, no employees, no trading history. They're classic shell corporations, the kind of entities people set up to move money around without leaving a trail. They're designed to look legitimate from a distance, but when you get up close, there's nothing there. It's a house of cards." The words hit me like a physical blow. Ghosts. A house of cards. It was the first concrete piece of evidence, the first solid ground I'd felt under my feet since this nightmare began. My suspicions weren't the paranoid ramblings of an old man. They were real. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I needed to hear him say it. It means your son-in-law isn't an investor, Theo, Earl said, his voice hard as granite. He's a con man. These companies are likely fronts for some kind of fraud. He's probably using them to launder money or to create the illusion of a successful business to lure in other investors. He paused, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Listen to me, my friend. This is serious. You need to be very, very careful. A man who builds a world out of lies will do anything to keep it from collapsing. I thanked him, my throat too tight to say much more, and hung up the phone. I sat there in the fading afternoon light, the receiver still warm in my hand. The truth was beginning to surface, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. Chad wasn't just a manipulative husband. He was a criminal. He hadn't just taken my money. He had built his entire life on a foundation of deceit, and he had dragged my daughter down into the middle of it. The memory of her signature on those papers flashed in my mind again, but this time with a new, terrifying implication. She wasn't just a victim of his emotional abuse. She was a pawn in his financial crimes. Her name was on those ghost companies. Legally, she was just as entangled in this web of lies as he was. A cold dread far deeper than any I had felt before settled over me. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was about my daughter's freedom. The revelation that Chad was a fraud, a builder of ghost companies, was a heavy blow. But the next discovery was the one that shattered everything. It came not from a friend or a contact, but from my own past, my own careful habits. After the call with Earl, I couldn't sit still. I went to the old filing cabinet in my study, a sturdy oak piece I had built decades ago. It was where I kept every important document of my life. Tax returns, mortgage papers, old business records from the workshop. I started pulling out files, my hands searching for something, anything that could connect to the names Earl had given me. And then I found it. A thick folder labeled Workshop Sale 2018. It contained all the paperwork from when I sold my business, the sale that had funded Anika and Chad's down payment. I hadn't looked at it in years. As I sifted through the familiar documents, a single, unfamiliar page slipped out and fell to the floor. It was a loan guarantee application. The lender was a name I didn't recognize, but the amount made my blood run cold: $250,000. It was dated just 6 months ago. The business name listed as the recipient of the loan was Apex Pinnacle Holdings, one of Chad's ghosts. My eyes scanned down the page, my heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. And then I saw it. Under the section for the guarantor, the person legally responsible for the entire debt was my name, my social security number, a copy of my driver's license, and at the bottom a signature that was a near-perfect forgery of my own. He hadn't just taken the money I gave him. He had stolen my name. He had stolen my identity. He had taken the good credit and solid reputation I had spent 72 years building and used it to secure a massive fraudulent loan for his house of cards. I sank into my chair, the paper trembling in my hand. This was a betrayal on a scale I couldn't comprehend. It was a violation so profound, so personal, it felt like he had reached into my chest and torn something out. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was a fundamental desecration of my life, my legacy. He had used me, my good name, as a shield for his crimes. And if those loans went into default, the banks wouldn't come looking for him and his ghost companies. They would come looking for me. They would take my home. They would take everything Amani and I had worked our entire lives for. The rage I felt was so pure, so absolute, it burned away every last trace of fear. This was the proof. This was the weapon Morris needed. It was the hard, undeniable evidence of a federal crime. Chad hadn't just built a cage for my daughter. He had been building one for me, too. And he was about to find out what happens when you try to trap a man who has nothing left to lose. My hands were shaking as I dialed Morris's number, but my voice was cold and steady. "David," I said when he answered. "It's Theo. I have it. I have the proof." "What is it?" he asked, his voice instantly alert, all business. "It's better if I show you," I said. "Can you come back to the house and come alone?" There was no hesitation. "I'm on my way." When Morris arrived, I didn't invite him to sit. I led him straight to my desk. I had the evidence laid out in a neat, undeniable line on the polished oak surface. I felt like a general preparing for battle. I pointed to the first piece of paper, my legal pad. "These are the companies Chad has been bragging about for years," I said, pointing to the names. "Apex Pinnacle Holdings, Sterling Horizon Ventures, Gold Key Capital. My friend at the bank confirmed it this afternoon. They're ghosts. Shell corporations registered to a P.O. box. They have no assets, no business. They're a complete fraud. Morris looked at the list, his jaw tightening. That's a start, he said. It establishes a pattern of deception, but it's not enough to get a warrant for his home. He could argue they're just failed startups. I know, I said, my voice dropping. But this is. I slid the single sheet of paper from the folder across the desk towards him. The loan guarantee application. Morris picked it up. I watched his eyes move across the page, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to shock and then to a cold, hard anger. He saw the amount. He saw the name of the shell company. And then he saw my name, my social security number, and the forged signature at the bottom. He looked up at me, the paper held tight in his hand. He stole your identity, Theo, he said, his voice a low growl. Yes, I said. He used my good name to fund his house of cards, and he did it 6 months ago. This was the moment. This was the turning point. The power in the room had shifted, moving from the shadows where Chad had been hiding and into this small lamplit study. It was no longer my word against his. It was his signature on a fraudulent federal loan document. Morris's hands were no longer tied. I had just given him a pair of bolt cutters. He carefully placed the document back on the desk as if it were a holy relic. This is it, he said, a new energy in his voice. This is everything. Identity theft, bank fraud. These are serious federal offenses. This gives me more than enough for a warrant. I can get access to everything now. His personal accounts, his business records, his phone records, everything. He looked at me, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw a predator in his eyes. The hunt was on. He thinks he's untouchable, Morris said. He's about to find out how wrong he is. The balance had tipped. The old carpenter had just handed the law the hammer it needed, and now it was time to bring it down. The moment Morris held that fraudulent loan document in his hand, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. He was no longer just my friend David. He was a hunter who had just been handed a clear set of tracks. He pulled out his phone, his movements swift and economical. I sat at my desk, a spectator, now watching the gears of a great and powerful machine grind into motion. "Get me Judge Miller," Morris said into the phone, his voice sharp with authority. "Tell him it's about that bank fraud case we discussed last week. No, this one's new, and it's airtight. I have evidence of identity theft, forgery, and multiple shell corporations tied to a potential kidnapping." The words filled the small room with a weight they hadn't had before. Kidnapping. Hearing him say it out loud made it terrifyingly real. My quiet personal investigation was over. This was a federal case now. For the next hour, my home, a place of quiet retirement, became a command center. Morris worked with a speed and intensity that left me breathless. He explained the strategy to me as he paced the floor, firing off calls and texts. The plan was a three-pronged attack, a net designed to close in on Chad from all sides, leaving him no room to run. First, we cut off his money. Morris explained, his eyes glinting with a cold fire. The warrant for bank fraud allows us to freeze every asset he has. His checking accounts, his investment portfolios, his credit cards, everything. By the time he realizes what's happening, he won't have enough cash to buy a bus ticket. Boss. It was a brilliant, ruthless move. Chad's entire world, his power, was built on the illusion of wealth. Morris was about to pull the plug on the whole charade. Second, he continued, we get eyes everywhere. The warrant will give us access to his home, his car, and his office. We're not just looking for Anika, we're looking for computers, documents, anything that connects him to these shell companies and this loan. We're going to dismantle his entire fraudulent enterprise. Finally, he looked at me, his expression serious. And third, we find your daughter. The felony warrants give us the right to get a real-time trace on both his and Anika's phones. We'll know where he is and hopefully where he's taken her. He was giving me back my hope piece by piece, but it was a hope tinged with a terrible anxiety. The trap was being set with terrifying efficiency. A silent digital net was tightening around my son-in-law, who was probably at that very moment enjoying a drink somewhere, convinced he had gotten away with everything. When all the calls were made and all the warrants were approved, Morris stood to leave. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You did good, Theo," he said. "You did what we couldn't. You gave us the key. Now let us open the door. We're moving on this now. Stay by the phone. Don't leave the house. We'll call you as soon as we have something." He left and the house fell silent once more. But this was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of despair. It was the tense electric quiet before a storm breaks. Amani and I sat in the living room, not speaking, just waiting. The trap was laid, the hunters were in position, and somewhere out there a monster was walking straight towards it, completely unaware that the old quiet man he had so thoroughly underestimated had just signed his final warrant. It was just after dusk when the phone rang again. My body jolted with a fresh wave of adrenaline. It was Morris. I answered, my heart in my throat. "Theo," he said, and his voice was devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of a man who had looked into the abyss. "We got the preliminary lab report back on the box." I held my breath, waiting. "The blood is a match for your daughter Anika," he said. "The DNA is conclusive." Even though I had expected it, the confirmation landed like a punch to the gut. My daughter's blood used as a prop in some sick game. "But it's what was inside the box that you need to hear about." Morris continued, his voice grim. "It wasn't a gift, Theo. It was a plant. It was a carefully constructed stage play designed to frame your daughter." I listened, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer calculated evil of it. Morris explained that inside the box, nestled under some tissue paper, they found two things. The first was a cheap disposable burner phone. The second was a thick manila envelope. Inside the envelope were fabricated documents, fake bank statements, showing large wire transfers to an offshore account and a printed-out flight confirmation to the Cayman Islands. Both were under Anika's name, and underneath it all was a typed letter, a suicide note, or rather a note designed to look like it was written by a woman on the verge of abandoning her life. Morris read a part of it to me over the phone. The words were cold, clinical, and utterly devastating. The letter spoke of a woman trapped in a suffocating marriage, suffocated by the constant interference of her overbearing parents. It painted a picture of Anika as a resentful, unstable woman who had been having an affair and was finally running away with her secret lover, taking all the money she could get her hands on. And then came the final, venomous twist. The letter ended by blaming me. It said that my constant distrust of Chad, my old-fashioned ways, and my inability to let her live her own life had been the final straw that destroyed their marriage. It was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty designed not only to give Chad the perfect alibi, but also to destroy my reputation and my relationship with my daughter forever. The blood on the box suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. It was a single dramatic detail meant to add a touch of authenticity to his story of an emotionally distraught woman. He probably told her he was playing a prank or coerced her somehow. It was a final piece of stage dressing in his elaborate production. The full scope of his plan crashed down on me with the force of a tidal wave. This was never just about money. It was about total annihilation. He was going to drain every last cent from our family, use my good name to commit fraud, and then make my daughter disappear. He would have played the part of the grieving, abandoned husband, perfectly showing everyone the proof she had sent me on Father's Day. He would have been seen as a victim while Anika was branded a thief and an adulteress, and I was remembered as the father who drove her away. He wouldn't have just escaped. He would have erased her, rewritten her entire life story, and left us to drown in the lies he created. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand. The man my daughter had married wasn't just a con artist. He was a monster, a meticulous, patient monster who had been planning this ending for a very, very long time. And the box on my coffee table was meant to be his final, triumphant performance. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow against my sanity. Amani and I sat in the living room, the coffee long since gone cold, just waiting. There was nothing left to say. We were suspended in a terrible limbo, caught between the horror of what we knew and the terror of what we didn't. Then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, my phone vibrated, a violent, jarring buzz against the polished wood of the end table. It was Morris. I snatched it up, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "Theo," he said, and his voice was tight, strained with adrenaline. "We have them. We have a location." Hope, fierce and painful, surged through me. "Both of them?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Yes," he said. "The warrants came through. We put a trace on both their phones. For the last few hours, they've been pinging together stationary. They're in a remote area in North Georgia near the mountains. Looks like a rental cabin. There's only one road in and one road out. He's got nowhere to run." He paused, and I could hear the sound of his car, the crunch of tires on what sounded like gravel. We're moving in now, Theo. I'll call you back when it's over. Just stay strong. The line went dead. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the waiting before. It was a silence filled with images with possibilities, each one more horrific than the last. I imagined a SWAT team, a standoff, a desperate act from a cornered man. Imani began to pray softly beside me, her quiet whispered words a thin thread of faith in the overwhelming darkness. I couldn't pray. I could only picture my daughter's face. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Minutes felt like hours. I paced the length of our living room back and forth, wearing a path in the old oriental rug, the same path I had worn when Annika was a baby with a high fever, the same path I had walked the night she went to her first prom. It was almost an hour later when the phone rang again. I stumbled, grabbing for it, my breath catching in my throat. Morris. "We have her, Theo," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion and the profound relief in his voice. "She's safe. She's alive." A sound escaped my lips, a strangled sob of pure, unadulterated relief. My legs gave out and I sank onto the sofa, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Imani rushed to my side, her eyes wide with frantic questions. I just nodded, tears streaming down my face, mouthing the words, "She's safe." Morris continued giving me the details in a clipped, professional tone. "We breached the property just after sunrise. He didn't put up a fight. I think he was so convinced of his own brilliance he never imagined we'd find him. He was in the main room packing a bag, getting ready to run." "And Anika," I choked out. "We found her in a locked bedroom in the back," he said, his voice softening. "She's shaken up, Theo. Bruised. But she's strong. She's a fighter just like her old man. The paramedics are checking her out now, but she's going to be okay." The wave of relief was so powerful it left me weak, hollowed out. She was alive. She was safe. That was all that mattered. The rest was just noise. "What about him?" I asked, a cold edge returning to my voice. "Chad Miller is in custody," Morris said. "He's on his way back to Atlanta. He'll be facing a long list of federal charges, bank fraud, identity theft, and now kidnapping. He's not going to see the outside of a prison cell for a very, very long time." The trap we had set, the one that had started with a small ugly box and a father's refusal to stay silent, had finally snapped shut. The monster was in a cage. My daughter was free, and the storm at long last was over. Morris told me later how it all ended for Chad. It wasn't in a dramatic shootout or a high-speed chase. It was in the quiet, air-conditioned lobby of a small-town bank about 50 miles north of the city. He had walked in there like he owned the place, dressed in a crisp linen shirt, radiating an aura of wealth and importance. He was trying to make a large cash withdrawal, the first step in his plan to disappear. He was completely unaware that the digital empire he had built was already a smoking ruin. The trap had been sprung hours ago. His accounts were frozen solid. His name was on a federal watch list. He was a king who didn't know he had already been deposed. The young bank teller, following instructions from the authorities, was polite but firm. The transaction was declined. Chad, of course, became indignant. He demanded to see the manager. He spoke of his powerful connections, of the trouble this small, insignificant bank would be in for inconveniencing him. He was loud, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He was in the middle of a condescending tirade about the incompetence of small-town employees when two men in plain clothes walked into the bank. One of them was Morris. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't shout. They just stood by the door watching him. Morris said the moment Chad saw him, every ounce of color drained from his face. The mask of outrage and entitlement didn't just crack, it disintegrated. In its place was the slack-jawed, hollow-eyed look of a man staring at his own ghost. He saw in an instant that the game was over. All his clever plans, all his intricate lies had amounted to nothing. The bravado evaporated, leaving behind something small, pathetic, and terrified. He didn't say another word. Morris and his partner walked calmly across the marble floor. "Chad Miller," Morris said, his voice echoing slightly in the suddenly silent bank. "You're under arrest for bank fraud, identity theft, and kidnapping." Chad didn't resist. He simply put his hands behind his back as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The last thing Morris told me he saw was Chad's reflection in the polished glass of the bank door as they led him away. The reflection of a man who had gambled everything on the belief that he was smarter than everyone else, only to be brought down by an old carpenter he had written off as a fool. The house of cards had finally come down. We saw our daughter in a quiet, sterile room at the hospital. She was sitting up in bed wearing a pale blue hospital gown that made her look small and fragile. There was a dark, ugly bruise on her cheek, and her eyes, though filled with an exhaustion that went bone deep, were clear for the first time in years. The moment she saw us, she broke down, and we rushed to her side, wrapping our arms around her, as she sobbed a storm of pent-up fear and pain finally being released. When the tears subsided, she began to talk, her voice quiet and hoarse. She told us everything. It all started to unravel a few months ago, she said, when she discovered the loan documents Chad had been making her sign weren't for investments but to cover massive debts from failed fraudulent deals. He was in over his head, and he was using her name and her credit to stay afloat. When she finally confronted him, he transformed. The charming, sophisticated man she married disappeared, replaced by a cold, cruel stranger. The verbal manipulation she had endured for years escalated into threats. He took her phone, her car keys, her credit cards. He made her a prisoner in their own home. He told me it was my fault, she whispered, her gaze distant, lost in the terrible memory. He said my negativity and my family's interference had ruined his business prospects. He started talking about a plan, a way to start over, a way to get rid of all the dead weight in his life. The dead weight was us. It was her. The Father's Day box was his masterpiece, his final act. He had come up with the entire plan with a chilling theatrical flair. He hit me when I refused to write the letter, she said, her hand instinctively going to the bruise on her cheek. He said he needed it to be believable. He held my hand, forcing me to write those horrible things about you and Mom. Her voice broke. Then he came at me with a pin. He said he needed one final touch for his story. He took the blood for the box. He told me that after Father's Day, after everyone thought I had run away, we would disappear. But I saw the look in his eyes, Dad. He wasn't planning for us to disappear. He was planning for me to disappear. In that moment, all the missing pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of a monster more depraved than I could have ever imagined. He was going to kill her. He was going to murder my daughter and use a Father's Day gift as his alibi. I looked at Anika, at the strength shining through her pain, and my heart ached with a love so fierce it was a physical force. I had been haunted by guilt, by the thought that my silence had contributed to this. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I should have acted sooner, that I should have fought for her. But she looked at me, her eyes locking with mine, and I saw not blame but a profound, bottomless gratitude. "You knew, Dad," she whispered. "When you got that box, you didn't just see a gift, you saw me. You heard me when I couldn't even speak. You saved my life." I reached out and took her hand, my calloused, wrinkled fingers wrapping around hers. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't need to. The long, silent war was over. I just held her hand and said the only words that mattered. "You're home now, baby girl. You're home." And in the quiet of that sterile hospital room, our family, broken and battered, finally began to heal. A few weeks have passed. The house is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet now. It's the gentle, healing silence of peace, not the heavy, oppressive silence of fear. Annika is staying with us, and every day I see a little more of the old light returning to her eyes. She laughs more. She started sketching again, her architectural designs spread across the dining room table. We don't talk much about what happened. We don't have to. We are simply rebuilding plank by plank a family founded on truth. On Father's Day, my daughter sent me a box. I never opened it. It sits now in an evidence locker somewhere, its cruel contents cataloged and filed away. But I realize now that it was the most important gift I have ever received. It wasn't a gift of love, but a gift of clarity. It forced me to open my eyes to a truth I had refused to see for far too long. I had spent years choosing a fragile peace over a necessary conflict, believing that my silence was a form of protection. I was wrong. I learned that true strength, true love, isn't about avoiding the storm. It's about being the anchor in the middle of it. My name is Theodore Covington, and I am 72 years old. I am a retired carpenter. And on the day my world almost ended, I learned that the most powerful tools a man has are not the ones he holds in his hands, but the ones he holds in his heart. A lifetime of wisdom, a network of true friends, and a father's unyielding love. I didn't open the box. Instead, I opened my eyes. And in doing so, I was able to save my daughter and reclaim the one thing a man can truly call his own, his dignity.